Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's training. Thank you for being here today. We are going to get started. Thank you so much for your patience. This is mobilizing support for people with disabilities who have experienced sexual violence and special considerations for rape crisis centers. Just to do some housekeeping, all attendees are muted, and we wanted to let you know that you can turn on your closed captions by selecting the arrow on the closed captions button, and you can select show subtitles. We do encourage you to use the chat to ask questions during the presentation. We will make time for questions at the end, but please continue to put those in the chat as we go along. Another note is that Christine Beck will be organizing any CEUs that you may need. So if you need to get in touch with her, she probably has reached out to you already. And if you need to work on that further, please connect with her. Okay, thank you so much. So here we go. My name is Tara Ahern, and I'm the project director with the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance. I'm also one of two co-chairs for Illinois Imagine Chicago, and I'm also the AAPD Hearn Leadership Awardee, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Adam, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Adam Weiser. I'm part of I'm an Alliance ambassador, and I'm also from Center for Independent Futures.
Great.
And hi, everybody. I'm Maggie Arthur. I am a prevention educator with Resilience, which is one of Chicago's largest serving rape crisis centers. I also use she and they pronouns. Both are comfortable, and I'm glad to see y'all.
Okay, so here are the objectives that we're going to discuss today. First, we will recognize the intersection of disability and sexual violence and its impacts on survivors. Describe ways to support people with disabilities who've experienced sexual violence. Examine Illinois Imagine's resources. And lastly, design a foundation for action planning to mobilize support. Just to give you a little background on why we're here today, as I mentioned before, I received a grant through a leadership award through the American Association of People with Disabilities this March. So my project is to engage survivors of sexual violence, people with disabilities, and collaborate with rape crisis centers and disability service providers to do regional and statewide work in the hopes of improving services and policies. And lastly, opportunities for people with disabilities. I think that's worth noting that all of the work that we are doing this year is really for and by people with disabilities. And everyone working on this project is people with disabilities are getting paid competitive wages for their time and expertise in this subject. And then lastly, the Alliance has done a lot of work with local teams around the state to organize around this issue and do trainings, which we're here today doing. And lastly, support advocates in any way that we can. Okay, Adam, tell us what our first objective is.
Recognize the intersection of disability and sexual violence and its impact on survivors.
Thank you. Okay, so Maggie and I are going to talk a little bit about internal bias and ableism. I think this is a great place to start the presentation, just by really putting out there that, we all come to our work with our own internal bias. And I think that that's an important part of, any deep dive. And so we want to be really conscious of societal beliefs about people with disabilities and how they affect our own personal beliefs and biases. And lastly, ableism. I don't know if any of you have heard that before, but ableism is a form of discrimination. It's the false idea that disabled people are inferior. And when in truth, disability is just another way for a mind and body to be. So I know Maggie has some really great thoughts about this, and I'm gonna let her share a little bit.
Thanks, Tara. So yeah. We Tara and I talked a lot about this beforehand, just about sort of our own comfort levels of addressing these biases and these isms, if you want to call it, ableism being one of them. And we felt that ultimately it was really important to address, both because we're trying to build the foundational skills to challenge those biases and to be able to meet survivors where they're at, but also because the longer we sit in our comfort space, the more likely we actually can become to act out some of these isms, some of these biases. If we're not challenging what feels comfortable to us every once in a while, there's a good chance that we might step into some of these ableist spaces. And so we were both curious if y'all could, in the chat, give us some examples of barriers to survivors with disabilities seeking support, seeking services. So go ahead and type in the chat, what do you think is keeping survivors with disabilities from getting the support they need? We've got, they think they won't be believed. Absolutely. Which is something that's common across all survivors, is that fear of not being believed. Absolutely. Communication barriers, certainly. If we're not communicating with them, we're certainly not meeting them where they need to be. Absolutely. Not knowing what services are. Yeah, absolutely. We don't know what we don't know, right? Yeah. And accessibility challenges, definitely. Not able to get transportation, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. That's a great one.
So unfortunately, our society has this very particular vision of who is a survivor of sexual violence. And that vision tends to be a 20-something, moderately attractive white woman, able-bodied, cisgender, pretty across the board. That is our assumption or perception of who a survivor is. And so therefore, services for survivors are created with that vision in mind. They're created for that particular type of person. But we know that all people can experience sexual violence, can experience gender-based violence, and they are going to need different accommodations, different services based on their identity, based on what they need. So Tara, do you want to be our Vanna White and reveal the rest?
Yes, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, so we talked about stereotypes and myths about disability that exist. And yeah, Maggie, thanks for touching on the rape culture myths. Absolutely. There are definitely barriers within the rape crisis service provision system, and then also what people believe to be true about rape and what is and isn't true, right? So the lack of information about services, I think that that's a huge one. The survivor community in general, and also the disability community can also be a barrier. And lastly, we heard from Adam that accessibility can be a really huge issue, including transportation, just getting to, getting out of your home to the hospital, in the community, and lastly, accessing rape crisis centers. We've seen that some buildings are not accessible, whether it's physical space or it could be, just information in a readable format. So lots of barriers here. Okay, and then next, if we could have everyone type in the chat some disability myths that you are aware of. So anything about disability that you've heard of, or yeah, thank you, Jajin, that people with disabilities are asexual. Yeah, that's a huge one. I think that goes back to a lot of fears and stigmas around people with disabilities, especially people with developmental disabilities who we may assume are low functioning, right? And that's definitely not a phrase that we like to use. And we know that adult bodies crave adult things, right? And so that's definitely a myth for sure. Let's see, that people can't live at home, that they need help all the time, that they do not have the ability to use their voice and make their own choices. That's, In some ways that can be true, right? I think that we definitely see a culture of compliance with individuals with disabilities, especially those living in congregate settings such as institutions or group homes or nursing homes, where people need to ask permission to do just about everything, that they really don't have autonomy and they don't have the ability to make their own choices. And so self-advocacy is something that we want to see and encourage, but people might not have those opportunities to be advocates. So not have the ability to be sexual or have romantic relationships, yeah, that they're not able to do that. And in some ways, again, that's true too, right? If we don't want to educate folks about their own body autonomy and sexuality, they might not have those opportunities. And so they're certainly capable. And yes, that is definitely a myth. That people are not attracted to them. Yep, that's another one. And lastly, that they can't work, they're not smart, that people with disabilities are bad parents, or that they can't live independently. Yeah, so I think that a lot of these go back to societal beliefs about disability, right? That people are dependents, that, the ways that we describe and view disability, as opposed to something that is a result of an environment, right? That society makes disability, right? We can have certain challenges. Like I have several disabilities, and for example, I have vision challenges, and so my glasses really help me to navigate the world, right? And the same is true about other assistive devices like wheelchairs and walkers and canes. Those things make it easier to navigate the world. It's the world that isn't accessible to us, right? So if a building doesn't have ramps and it doesn't have those elbow things where you can open a door, that's a problem of society, right? So that's just kind of something to think about. And then let's talk through some more. Yeah, that people with disabilities are childlike or dependents. Here's another one, that they're not credible. We see this time and time again. I think that this is something that I think we could agree happens in the survivor community, that people who experience sexual violence are not, that they're lying, when we know in fact that's not true, right? That false reporting rates are no different than any other crime. And so, that's something that we definitely see here, that people with disabilities, especially people with developmental disabilities or mental health challenges, that they are not to be trusted and that they're just lying. Lastly, or not lastly, to go on, that they can't or shouldn't have children. This is something that is particularly ableist, right? That we see time and time again. And then that they can't or don't work, and that people are dangerous. That's something that we come up against a lot. Okay, Adam, tell us our second objective, please.
Describe ways to support people with disabilities who have experienced sexual violence.
Great, thank you. Okay, and Adam, tell us if you could read this slide too, that'd be great.
All right. Effects of sexual violence on people with disabilities: fear, shock, confusion, doubt, shame, guilt, humiliation, powerfulness, isolated, vulnerable, dirty, or damaged, self-blame. People with disabilities and people without have, excuse me.
You're okay.
Without have similar types of reactions and effects.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is great. This is a great slide to demonstrate that, people with and without disabilities, the effects are no different. And I think that's definitely important to remember. Okay, Adam and Maggie.
So we thought that instead of just sort of telling you how to follow these steps to ask these questions, we would show you. So Adam, do you want to kind of walk through these items under check for understanding with me? So if you could ask me to explain something in my own words, how would you ask me that?
Can you please tell me in your own words how to describe something?
Yeah. So if I'm the survivor here in this scenario, I might not use words like rape or abuse. I might use something more vague, like when it happened or the situation or the incident, right? And we're all advocates on this call. You're familiar with this. And it's important that we're mirroring the language that they're using. So we're saying, if they don't say abuse, we don't say abuse, right? We don't want to put words in their mouth because that can kind of take power away. So Adam, do you want to go to the next one?
Can you help to explain in someone else's own words what they mean?
Yeah, so again, we want to make sure that we're using the words that the survivor is using, and we want to make sure that we as advocates are not putting words in their mouth. We're not speaking for them, but also too, we want to make sure that we're not allowing their guardians or people with them, their caretakers, to be speaking for them either. And later on, we're going to talk about the sort of legality around caretakers and guardians too. But it is important to keep in mind that we shouldn't be allowing them to speak for the survivor either.
Can you please tell me what you are thinking?
Yeah. So this can be one way that we're checking in as we go. So we're asking the survivor to share their story, and maybe they're asking us questions because, as we said before, there is this attitude of compliance for folks with disabilities. They are looking to others for feedback or validation. So it's important that we're checking in with them and we're actually asking them, well, what do you think about that? How does that feel to you? Rather than just kind of defaulting to us or the caretakers. And I'm going to pause, Adam, before the next one so that the interpreters can switch. Awesome. Okay, Adam, do you want to ask me the third bullet?
Can you tell me what is most important to you?
Yeah, and here's where we're asking them, what kind of outcome are you looking for? What do you want to get out of this situation? Do you want to get an exam done, an evidence collection kit done? Do you want to involve law enforcement or not? What is important to you? And again, not what is important to the people around you or your caregivers or your guardians. And then take us home, last one.
Am I going too fast or too slow for you?
Thank you. And this one's pretty self-explanatory. Adam, I'm curious, are these kinds of questions helpful for you when you're trying to understand what someone's explaining to you?
Yeah, I think it's important to me to ask those questions because I want to be on the same level as them so I can understand what they're going through.
Yeah, absolutely. And that last piece, don't pretend you understand if you don't. That's going to get you into trouble, right? If we're making assumptions or, just going along with what they're saying when we don't really understand.
Okay, so now we're going to talk specifically about some ways that we can support people with different disabilities, right? And so a lot of what we're going to go through in the next several slides is content that you can refer back to by looking at the PowerPoint. And so if we do go a little fast, just be aware that we will be sending out the slides and the recording for today's webinar, so you will have access to this. But if there are specific questions that you have or things that you want to troubleshoot, please put that in the chat or feel free to email us. We're happy to go through that. So in regards to survivors who are deaf or hard of hearing, American Sign Language, that's the primary language that is used today. And it's a unique combination of gestures and movements. And it's used as a communication tool, not as part of the conversation. So this is something that we like to teach, that whenever you're interacting with a person with a disability, look at the person, right? Don't refer or defer to a helper or a guardian or a parent. It's really important that that person, even if you don't know what they're saying, or you're overwhelmed or you're stressed, just make sure to give that person the attention that they deserve and maintain eye contact with the deaf person. And some people, they have the same confidentiality as the client. So the interpreter does, just to be aware of that. Okay, Maggie.
Yeah, so just to go through these, as Farah said, fairly quickly. Same as we were saying before, as Adam and I demonstrated, ask for what accommodations they need, don't assume. Offer support that they want, but again, always with their consent. Don't ever try to push your support onto this person. It's always a good sort of way to keep in mind or ground yourself. They've been existing in this world that was, creates challenges for them all day, every day, their whole life up until now. If they say they don't need your help, trust them, they don't need your help. And I think another good thing to just keep in mind for all survivors that we work with, but again, especially for survivors with visual impairments, is to be communicating each step of the way before you do something. So to be continually checking in with them to make sure that they understand what's happening and also that they're comfortable. And then asking those questions of how you can make them more comfortable or more at ease in the moment. And then the last thing to keep in mind when it comes to guide dogs, assistance animals, they are not our pets. They are an extension of us. They are a aid, just like any other aid that we may use. And so therefore, while they may be just adorable, they are not there for you to pet or hang out with. Quick question. Are there any places where a service animal is not allowed in Illinois, we'll say? And you can just yes or no in the chat. What do you think? Maybe this feels like a trick question. It's not supposed to. Okay, yeah, we got some answers coming in. Yeah, service animals are allowed to be anywhere that their person, the person who is using them is as well. And that can be an opportunity for advocacy for you as a rape crisis center advocate for this person. If you are in a hospital or in a police station or wherever you are with your client and they're saying anything about their service animal, this is an opportunity for advocacy and reminding them that this animal is necessary for this person. You passed quiz 1.
Okay, so we actually had a really interesting question that came in privately about the definition of the word advocate in different settings. So this is something that I'm glad came up and goes back to something that Maggie and I talked about before we started today, and just the opportunity to collaborate outside of your own organization. The word advocate in the disability space can mean many things, right? So Adam, can you tell me what is an advocate to you? What does that mean to you?
An advocate means for me to stand up to what I think is right and to go out in the community and help others if they need my help.
Right. So would you would you say that you're a self-advocate?
I am a self-advocate,
Right.
yes.
Okay. So sometimes in the disability world, we refer to people with disabilities as advocates, especially in the developmental disabilities space. Some people will say clients or people that receiving services. But some at the Alliance, the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, we provide support to self-advocates, people that may be learning about speaking up about for themselves, and then people who are really good at it, right? So lots of deviations on that. Maggie, what does advocate mean in the Rape Crisis Center context?
I am really glad that we are talking about this because
Yeah.
in the Rape Crisis Center context, advocacy is similar but fundamentally different. So what I'm hearing is that in the realm of disability advocacy, an advocate is often a person with a disability who is advocating for themselves. Whereas in the Rape Crisis Center context, an advocate tends to be a volunteer or a professional who is advocating on behalf of a survivor. That doesn't necessarily mean those identities don't cross, right? An advocate can also be a survivor, but they are not in that moment, right? They are an outside support in that moment.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that just to, kind of put some more layers onto this, what we see typically in the disability space, developmental disability in particular, is that for generations and we families, guardians, teachers, individuals of that nature have been advocates pushing the movement forward, primarily for people with developmental disabilities, right? And in other parts of the disability community, that's not necessarily the case. And so a big objective of the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance and the DD advocacy movement in particular now is that people with disabilities, developmental disabilities, should be in charge of their own movement. They should have autonomy and rights and all the same things that anyone else that without a disability has. And so that's definitely something that we are pushing for. We want to hear from people receiving services. And of course, it's important to hear from advocates, family and staff, but we also, we want to be in the room where it happens, right? Adam, we've talked about that before. And what's nothing about us without us? Can you describe or summarize what that means to you?
It means like without a disability, what is there out there?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And also, people receiving services need to be in the room, right? That we want to be helping to make those decisions that are about us. Because how can someone who doesn't understand what my life is like make decisions for me about me? That doesn't really make sense, right? We're perfectly capable of sharing what our needs are. So absolutely. Okay. So then when we're talking about survivors with a mental health diagnosis, a lot of these things are going to be the same. Safe spaces, avoid re-traumatizing. These are things that you all are well aware of. And as Maggie said, teaching and modeling coping skills and exploring trauma histories in a way that's, gentle, and also recognizing historical oppression. This is a great point, that people with disabilities have experienced oppression throughout generations. And then we add in race and gender identity, things that make these issues really complex. And so we want to be really aware of how these things manifest themselves, and that when we're engaging with survivors, that we are, really keeping that in our minds. Okay.
And survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're just going to keep reiterating this, but it is absolutely worth repeating. Ask questions. Ask them questions, ask them to clarify, ask them what they need, and don't make assumptions. I think a big piece of this is actually goes for folks who are providing services for people with disabilities, like caregivers, guardians, and folks who work in that realm, as well as rape crisis centers, is we might have our own biases or assumptions based on what we know about a particular disability diagnosis, right? So we may have an understanding of what someone on the autism spectrum does or can do, or their abilities. And we may consciously or subconsciously apply that understanding to a person before we actually investigate whether or not it's true for them. And so we want to make sure, again, that we are treating all survivors. We're explaining things to them in ways that they can understand, in ways that are accessible to them, and that we're not treating them differently based on our assumptions or biases or even our well-intended understandings of disability, right? And then the last thing on this list is exploring living arrangements and safety needs. So that's a perfect transition to our next big piece, which is specifics around safety planning for folks with disabilities.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that another thing to note about survivors with developmental disabilities is that even in the DD world, the developmental disabilities world, we have advocates in that space, whether, there's internalized ableism or there's guardians or staff who, are ableist, right? And so we get questions from providers a lot. How do we know if someone's been sexually assaulted? How do we communicate with people who don't use words, right? And technically, the phrase is nonverbal, which is not really politically correct. People communicate in all different kinds of ways. And, though, just to be kind of really transparent that this happens in the disability space. So we want to just be really honest about that and really supporting an individual to just, I think a really good tip is identify how someone communicates yes and no. I think that's a great place to start. If it's blinking, squeezing of a hand, if it's eye gaze, their eyes go a certain way. Maybe they have assistive technology that they can use. I think those are things that we can utilize to help us communicate with an individual, and just to be aware that sometimes if the person that's supporting this individual isn't, they might not even be at that level where they're respecting the individual, right? So we do see that people with disabilities are abused and neglected, and sometimes they're the people that are assaulting them are the ones who are withholding technology or keeping them sort of like in a space where they can't communicate. So just some things to kind of keep in mind. Just figure out how a person communicates and go from there. So Maggie, thanks for that segue. Thanks for letting me go off on a tangent there.
Yeah. No, and I wanted to also just one last thing to add about that is we also all live in this rape culture too.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, even the folks who are super supportive and amazing and not ableist at all may still have some internal biases when it comes to survivors and when it comes to sexual violence. And so we may see an aide or a guardian or even a partner of a survivor who is doubting their story, who is asking them those like horribly triggering questions like, what were you wearing or why were you there, right? We have to see that we are really operating at the intersection of two big areas of prejudice in our society, ableism and rape culture, right? And so again, as advocates, it is our job to see both of those sort of ends of the spectrum, if you will. All right, so to jump into safety planning, again, this is stuff that y'all are largely familiar with because the work of sexual violence is so close to the work of domestic violence. So we're gonna be following a lot of the same rules, right? In terms of what are we doing to intentionally restore power? How are we playing on the strengths and knowledge of the individual first and foremost, those kinds of things. So these slides offer just some more specific questions that we can ask to a survivor, first of all, to get the conversation going. So I'm going to ask you, when do you safety plan? Is there like a light that goes off in the ER that tells you it's time to develop a safety plan? Is there like a secret password? When do we know it's time to safety plan? You can put it in the chat. Adam, I'll look to you since maybe folks are taking a second to answer. If you're talking to a survivor who's telling you their story, and it sounds like they're maybe living with a person who is harming them, would you say that's a good time to start talking about a safety plan?
Yes, very much, because you want to understand what they're going through, and you want to say, let's start making a plan because we want you to be safe. We don't want you to be with that person who's trying to hurt you anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So, based on what they're telling you, that maybe there are some things about their life that are making them unsafe. Again, don't make assumptions, but you can hear that, and then you can ask them those clarifying questions, like Adam showed us, like, can you explain this to me in your own words? Or what do you mean by this? Or how does that make you feel? And so again, on the slide, we have some more like just starting off simple, like what makes you feel safe or what makes you feel unsafe, and then expanding from there. Like, are there things that are making it difficult for you to stay safe? And we might need to talk about their living situation. We might need to talk about their care providers that they're around. We might need to talk about some challenges that are specific to their disability and the body that they're living in. Like, are there things that make it difficult for you to stay safe when you are with this person who is harming you? And how can we develop a plan that that we can work around those challenges, right? And then we want to move into identifying and understanding the person who's harming them. We want to have a good perception of what does this harm look like and how is it coming up. So I'm going to pause before we go into this so that the interpreters can switch. All right, looks like we're good to go. Awesome. So in addition to leaning on the survivor's expertise of their situation, something I think it's always important to remind ourselves is that that survivor knows their situation best, but they also know their abuser best. They know that person who's harming them better than anyone else does, because chances are they are already implementing different things to keep themselves safe on the day-to-day. Chances are they already know what the cycle of violence looks like and entails for them, and they know that better than anybody else. So lean on that information when you're asking these next questions of like, what concerns them the most? How, and some ways that we can also notice how this abuser is acting or how they are harming this person is, how are they reacting to your disability in public versus in private? Like, how do they talk about it to other people? Is it a way that is, empowering to you or inclusive of you, or is it a way where you feel like they're talking about you as though you're not there, right? Things like that can give us a clue as to how this relationship is working. And then we need to be identifying that survivor's strengths and playing on those, meaning, again, asking, what are you already doing that's keeping you safe? And how can we expand on that? What kinds of things do you need on a day-to-day? And how can we make those things available to you so they're easy to grab and when you need to get out the door, right? And then finally, and this is a huge, huge one, is what is your abuser's involvement with your assistance or disability supports? Maybe you have close relationships with your teachers or with other advocates, right? What kind of relationship do they have? Because isolation is a huge, huge commonly used tactic in abuse. And that's a really big opportunity for an abuser to create distance between this person who they're harming and the people who are there for them to support them. And then finally, I added the link there to a safety plan template that comes from the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. This template is thorough and with a capital T. It is multiple pages long. I would strongly encourage you flip through it, if not include it in your advocacy bag, just in case you need it. And honestly, it's a really good one for all survivors that you're going to encounter. All right, so we've got a couple of scenarios that we're hoping we can kind of go through some of the legal ins and outs of what working with folks with disabilities who are survivors looks like. So this first one is your client's guardian is insisting a sexual assault exam must be done. The survivor is kicking, screaming, and not willing to consent to the exam. And so our question for you is, how would you approach the guardian first? And how would you approach the survivor? What would you say to them? And so we're going to give you a second. If you want to grab a piece of paper and kind of jot down your thoughts, you're welcome to. Or if you want to let us know in the chat, that would be helpful too. We're going to give you about 60 seconds to think about this, and then we're going to give you our answers. So again, what we're looking for is, how would you approach this guardian? And then after that, what would you say to the survivor to support them? So that's about a minute. So I'm going to ask you, Adam, if you were in a situation like this, how do you think you would react? Let's start with, if you had to speak to this guardian who was insisting that the survivor needed to do something that they clearly don't want to do, what do you think you would say to that guardian, Adam?
I would say, that that the guardian needs to give time to the victim and the specialist so they can come up with a plan, and when the plan is knowing how to do it, then the guardian can come back in and talk with the specialist and the victim.
Yeah. I think that's an awesome idea, is to just give them some space, maybe the survivor is reacting so strongly because the guardian is being kind of pushy. And so if we can ask that person to just step away, we might be able to have a totally different conversation with the survivor, because it might make them feel a little more safe and a little more comfortable. I think that's a great idea. And then in terms of what we can say to the survivor, I like your idea too of let's develop a plan. We can explain to you what's going to happen, and you can tell us if you're comfortable with those things. And we can make a plan so that when your guardian does come back in the room, we're ready, right? So let's go to the next slide, Tara. Perfect. Adam, do you want to read over these guardianship points?
Okay. Guardianship is a legal relationship between a person or an entity, an adult who has been determined in a court of law to be unable to make decisions on their own behalf. There are three main kinds of guardianships: guardian of estate, property, and assets, guardian of person, and limited guardianship.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh.
And then this next piece, the guardian of a person's authority is spelled out in a court document, and it may or may not include authority for medical care decisions, placement, and treatment or program decisions. So not all guardians are created equally. They have different outlined pieces that they're responsible for or not responsible for. And at the end of the day, even if that guardian is documented as being responsible for all of these things, we still need to first and foremost get the consent of the survivor and look to them as, again, the authority on their body and their situation.
Right. And just to note that guardians may be perpetrators. So just keeping that in mind too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So now we have our second scenario, which Maggie's going to go through. And I will remind you that we do want this to be an interactive webinar. So please, please join in the conversation. It's going to be better if we all participate. So I we'll give you extra CEUs. No, just kidding. We won't. Just wanted to see if you're listening.
So scenario 2 is your adult client doesn't communicate using words, and his guardian is insisting she must see his records in order to communicate on his behalf. Before she arrived, however, you were communicating with the client using his iPad. So our question to you for this one is, what concerns do you have about giving the guardian your client's records? And again, you can take a second to think about it and maybe provide your thoughts in the chat. And I see we have a great question in the chat that I think we're about to answer. So I see you, J-Jen. I'm just pausing on that one. All right, so Adam, I'm going to put you on the spot again. So we're in the situation where we're interacting with a client, and as soon as their guardian shows up, suddenly this client stops communicating with us. What do you think is going on, Adam? What might be happening?
That the person might be uncomfortable with that guardian being in there because they may know something that the victim may know something that the adult knows, and so they may not be available to want to tell that person.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe they're worried about the guardian themselves. As Tara said, sometimes guardians can actually be the ones who are causing abuse. or maybe they are just worried about that confidentiality piece. So, I mean, in a normal classroom setting, I would ask here to show me by, show of hands, who's super comfortable talking about sex and sexuality in front of their parents. And most of the time I wouldn't get a lot of hands, right? Because it feels a little awkward. And so maybe this client or the survivor is just feeling uncomfortable having this conversation in front of their guardian or in front of their parent. And that can be something as simple as just asking them to leave the room so that we can have a one-on-one. Or maybe they are feeling really scared or nervous about their guardian being in the room for other reasons. But the only way that we're going to find out is by asking them, right? And one of the ways that we can sort of approach the topic without saying outright, hey, I noticed that when your guardian showed up, you clammed up. What gives? We can ask something more like, you seem kind of uncomfortable. Is there anything I can do to make you feel more comfortable in the situation? Is there anything you need right now, so that we can keep talking? That kind of thing. And let them ask you what they need. All right, and next slide, and I think this is going to get to, and I want to see in the chat, I see I'd confirm guardianship status. Oh, that's a good one. We totally missed that. We're just operating on the assumption that this person is the right person. So yeah, confirming that this is a guardian. And I would look at what they have guardianship over. Yeah, absolutely. So maybe they don't even have guardianship over medical decisions. So maybe that's causing some of the discomfort here. Definitely. So asking those questions, super important. And so the important things to keep in mind here are that thanks to amendments to CECEDA in 2011, now any adult with a legal guardian can decide whether his or her guardian can have access to Rape Crisis Center records. They can also decide whether or not to waive Crisis Center privilege. And if they cannot decide, the court has to be brought in. But so in those moments, though, maybe when we're in the ER and we're immediately meeting the survivor for the first time, we do need to default to they have the authority here. They can make those decisions. And again, thanks to CECEDA amendments in 2011. So I wanted to actually launch a quick poll just so that we can get an idea of how comfortable we are with these CECEDA amendments before we go on. I don't want to bore you with the details if you don't need them. So please participate in this poll. We're asking you, basically, do you need a refresher on those amendments, or do we feel pretty comfortable?
And while results are coming in, Maggie, for those who may be watching this webinar who are not from the Rape Crisis Center world, can you just tell us what CECEDA is, just for folks who may want to reference it after the webinar? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So CECEDA stands for the Sexual Assault Survivors Emergency Treatment Act. So now you understand why we abbreviate it. It's very long.
Yeah.
And it's an Illinois law that governs the healthcare that hospitals are responsible for providing to survivors when they go there for services following an assault. And so some important notes about CECEDA are that it applies to all survivors, regardless of whether or not they decide to get an evidence collection kit done. Maybe they just go to the hospital because they need maybe they need physical things that are wrong with them addressed, like they have bruises or cuts or whatever, or maybe they go because they want emergency contraception or emergency STI prevention measures. Any of those services, CECEDA still applies. And so I'm going to end the poll and share results. So it looks like, actually, I'm surprised at this. It's about an even split between folks who are pretty comfortable with Suceda and folks who are brand new to it. Okay, that's totally fine. Thank you so much. That gives me a lot to work off of. So in this call, I'm by no means a Suceda expert, so please, please, please utilize the resources we'll give you at the end to learn more if I can't answer any of your questions. But as I have been a support for survivors for about a decade now, I'm gonna say in this call I'm the resident expert. So we'll see how it goes. So Tara, could you take us to the next slide? Thank you. So we're just going to go through a couple of the big points to keep in mind. And then, as Tara said before, these slides are available for you to refer back to get more info. So when it comes to consent to medical treatment and evidence collection, again, this is the same for all survivors, regardless of their ability, right? And that big piece is that we are asking for their consent to any services before we do them. And we should all know that one of the big pieces of consent is that it is informed. So we cannot ask them for consent to services they don't understand. So we need to be providing explanations or materials in whatever way makes sense for them to communicate that those concepts before we're getting their consent. And also too, to reiterate, they do not need parental or legal guardianship to consent to those services unless it is outlined in their guardianship documents that is the case for them. All right, next slide. So one thing I just want to highlight here is that if a person is unable to consent to the release of evidence, i.e. after the kit is done and we're making the decision, do we want to get this kit tested? And that's the release of evidence, or do we want to hold on to it for now? If the person is unable to consent to that, the law enforcement officer may release the evidence if the guardian is unavailable or unwilling to do so. That's going to be a very specific instance. And again, I can't go into the nitty-gritty of the legal aspects here, but know that that is an option. And one thing I would say for advocates in this call right now is be so cautious of this, because a few reasons. One, once confidentiality or privilege is broken or opened up, it cannot be closed again. So once we have allowed for that confidentiality to be open, to be released, we can't dial it back. And so that could potentially affect this client's case later on. And so we need to be very careful when we're making that decision. And there is a waiting period. We don't need to make this decision right away. Once we get the kit done, it can be closed and put on a shelf for a couple of days before we make the decision to release that information. So it may feel very urgent, but it doesn't have to be. We need to be very cautious in proceeding with this kind of decision. Another big reason why we need to be careful with this is, again, that restoring power aspect. So we know that there is a history of folks with disabilities not being believed or taken seriously about their own bodies. We also know that has happened at the hands of law enforcement a lot. So when we are making a decision to allow law enforcement to act on one's behalf, we got to keep that stuff in mind too, of maybe where their intentions are. All right, next slide. And so consent to services, self-explanatory, includes not just what we're doing, but what we're doing with that information, the risks and consequences of any steps thereon after. And I think we lost the interpreter, so I'm going to pause for a second.
We already switched, so it's okay.
Okay, I don't see Amy. Oh, there you are. Okay, great, perfect. All right, okay. So These next couple slides are really specific to medical advocacy. So this is really looking at those situations in the emergency room when you're advocating for a survivor who has a disability and might need, therefore, accommodations for that disability. And I want to just reiterate what Tara said before around establishing how the person communicates yes and no. That's huge. That's going to get you really far. And then just starting slow with general consent to anything, right? Consenting to every step of the way until that person is maybe showing you that they don't understand or showing you that they're uncomfortable. And just being patient, staying present, and helping them work through it is the best thing that you can do. And then again, ask what kinds of accommodations that they need. I want to turn to Adam here, our other resident expert on the call. If someone asks you what kinds of accommodations you need, like how do they usually pose that question?
They would ask, is there any accommodations that I need so I can get the help that I need during this situation?
Yeah. And what kind of answers do you typically give?
I'll write them down, and then I'll usually just look into the ones with that person that is the best for me, and then we'll make an action plan, and then we'll work through it.
That's great. So it sounds like sometimes people are giving you options too, and like asking you to choose from those options. Yeah, so I think it depends on the person and the situation, what is available to you. But both of those I think are great avenues, either offering different options and allowing the survivor to choose, or just asking them outright, what do you need? And can you explain to me in your own words what kinds of accommodations you need? I think both of those are great. As long as we're communicating in a way that everyone understands, we're doing good. All right, Tara, I'm going to actually ask you to skip, unless you wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, I wanted to add that, I think sometimes people with disabilities are not used to being asked what accommodations they may need. And I think that's important to remember, but also, as we move into talking more about action planning and how can your organization think about next steps in providing better services, this is something we want to be really conscious of. If you're asking people what accommodations they need or want, we need to be able to rise to the occasion, right? So I think sign language is something in particular that can be challenging, not because it's not a challenge to set up, but we need to have connections. We need to know who in our communities provide those services, what organizations, what is the lead time for booking an interpreter, how much will it cost, how will you fund those services, right? All of these things, once you figure it out, it's a piece of cake, right? And so I think also when we start talking through materials in alternate formats, just once we when we go through this and think about what are the things that we aren't doing that are allowing folks in our communities to access our services, those light bulbs will go off. So we're going to definitely talk more about that. And then Maggie, you said you wanted me to skip this one?
Yeah, if you want to just go to the next one.
Okay, great.
All right. So I just wanted to kind of bring us home with this thought that survivors may not be comfortable disclosing to you right away. And to kind of go off of what Tara was saying, they may not feel comfortable asking for those accommodations either, because again, we live in a world that is generally not made for them, right? And so they may feel uncomfortable or nervous about how that's going to be received. And this is another place where we need to be cautious of our internal biases as well, and checking those at the door, because someone might be able to mask or even pass as not having a disability, and they may do that in order to you know, not have to address these accommodations, but in actuality, doing so can be really exhausting and can really limit a person's ability to be present in that moment and in their body. And so if we are not setting it up to make them feel comfortable and safe disclosing to us, we're actually not meeting them where they're at. We're not giving them the support that they need. Something I really like that I heard once, and I actually wrote it on a sticky note, like put it on my wall, so I always keep this in mind, is that I don't care what you know until I know that you care. So I'm going to say that again. I don't care what you know until I know that you care. So you could come in so ready to have this accommodation conversation with this person, and until you're showing them that you actually care about what their answers are, they may not be listening, right? So we need to find in our own language and our own words how we can communicate to this person that they can trust us, that they can feel safe to disclose as much or as little as they want to us, and that we're going to work within our what we can to make those accommodations possible. And another thing that, again, most advocates have probably heard this plenty of times, is don't make promises you can't keep. That's not helpful for anyone. Telling a survivor that you can get them certain accommodations when you don't actually have a plan to do it is not going to build that relationship with that person for you, right? It could actually, in fact, damage that relationship and damage their ability to trust you. All right, so let's go to the next one. And so these next 3 slides actually are just really specific around how do we create accommodations in the ER around folks with physical disabilities. So I'm going to go ahead and jump through these for time, but they're there for you to refer back. And then I'm just going to pause here for a second. Something to note that I think is really incredible and underutilized is that the Chicago Hearing Society has sexual assault survivor advocates who are fluent in sign language and who are deaf. And that's huge. And I don't think that from what I hear from them in our Illinois Imagines meetings, I would say they're being underutilized. So find those resources. Maybe you don't even live in Chicago. Find those resources close to you and keep those numbers handy, because that can be like, imagine the difference it would make between having an ASL interpreter and having a person who is deaf, who is a trained advocate for survivors. Like, that would be incredible. All right, so let's go to this, our third and final scenario. Your client is a 17-year-old woman with Down syndrome. Following the evidence collection kit, you discuss therapy services at your agency. She is interested in counseling, but she's afraid her parents will find out. So what do you think you could tell this client concerning their privacy in accessing therapy services? So really the question here is, can she access therapy services without her parents finding out? And I'm going to go ahead and jump forward for the sake of time. And thank you. I'm seeing some answers coming in the chat. Yes, absolutely. So this applies to folks under 18 and also to adults with guardians. They can all access counseling services absolutely free of charge without the consent or notice to their guardian, unless, again, it is written that their guardian needs to be involved in those decisions. So depending on the rape crisis agency, you would obviously go through them to set that up, but it is important in that moment you can communicate to the survivor that they can 100% access counseling services for free, and no one has to know about it if they don't want them to. Now I pass
Okay.
it back to Tara for this next piece.
Okay, great. So just to let you know, in the chat function, in the chat feature, Jajin Pak, who is a great colleague of ours and co-chair for Illinois Imagines, has included the link to the ASL interpreter directory. So thank you for that. Excuse me. Now I want to talk to you very briefly about a House Bill, House Bill 3299, which passed earlier this year. So this bill is really, it's called loosely the sex ed bill. It started by a groundswell of self-advocates, i.e. people with developmental disabilities who were, really intentionally left out of conversations about sex ed in schools and at their agencies where they receive services. So people who have disabilities, if you weren't on the first webinar last Thursday, people with disabilities experience sexual violence at 7 times the rate of people without disabilities. About 80% of women with disabilities experience sexual violence, and the numbers for men, they vary depending on where you're getting that information, but it's around 30 to 60%, give or take. And so we do know that the reporting rates are very low. And as you all know, prosecution rates are extremely low. So you really, out of this comes a bill that was hard fought and was sponsored by the Guardianship and Advocacy Commission here in Illinois. And there was a lot of just to kind of give you some background, there's a lot of pushback from guardians and disability service providers, unfortunately. And I think that speaks to some of the barriers to service and myths about disability and sexuality that I referenced before, right? So these same myths and barriers exist in the disability system and world as much as they do outside of it. So there was a big push to hold town hall meetings around the state where the conversations were hard and frustrating and awkward at times and just kind of sad, just kind of really understanding how where we are as a society, especially in Illinois, and how important it is for advocates to have their voices heard, and that this is something that they wanted to pass. So the legislative process included witness slips and committee hearings, and finally we got the success, and so the House bill was passed. Okay. And then just to kind of, this is something that you guys you all can review at your own time, and there's actually a live link to review the bill. So this is anyone with a developmental disability receiving services in the state of Illinois. So whether that's through a day program, a community integrated living arrangement, or a group home, or more institutional settings, congregate settings. Wanting to just take a moment to acknowledge that sexual violence and domestic violence do not exist separately. They are often intertwined, right? And so unfortunately, as many of you may know, there's different funding silos to just sort of how things played out years and years ago in terms of funding and state organizations and committees. There is a project called Envision Illinois, which is similar to Illinois Imagines. It started in 2013 as a statewide collaboration and focuses on people with disabilities and works to transform the service system so survivors can have equal access to healing, safety, and justice, which is, again, very similar to Illinois Imagines. And they have created tons of resources that you can access through the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence at this website link here. And their work fosters collaboration between community organizations and people with disabilities, self-advocates, to improve systems change and help organizations respond more effectively to those when survivors have needs in their community. And then Maggie, I feel like, did you want to say anything else about DV and sexual violence kind of commingling?
Yeah, so one thing that I think I really appreciate about getting to work on this project and be on the Illinois Imagines Committee is the opportunity to hear from so many experts in the realm of disability, the realm of sexual abuse and domestic violence. And for those who work at sexual assault survivor agencies who are here on this webinar, you are, I'm sure, familiar with the siloing effect that we all experience, even though our work is so overlaps so much, especially even thinking just about sexual violence and domestic violence. We know that over half the time when there is an abusive relationship, sexual violence is happening within that relationship. However, our agencies don't often get to work together. And so we wanted to, Tara and I talked about, we really wanted to make sure to make a point that, like, when we are working together to create accommodations for our survivor populations, in doing so, we are also expanding our reach and our understanding of how we can support survivors in new and different ways, right? It's really just, at the end of the day, the principle of universal design, i.e. when we create a product or a campaign with those who are going to experience specific challenges accessing it, when we create it with them in mind, it benefits everyone. And so I really feel like that has come true with our collaboration on Illinois Imagines as well.
Okay, Adam, what is our next objective?
Examine Illinois Imagines resources.
Okay. And for the sake of time, Maggie, do you want to launch our last poll?
Yes.
I know we are kind of short on time, but we will kind of get through this here.
So we're curious if you know about Illinois Imagines. Okay. So far, the majority is yes, which is great. Since we've got about half, I will stop the poll. Yeah, so the majority of us, yes, which is amazing, especially considering the information we wanted to share. So I'm going to pause so that the interpreters can switch. Perfect. All right. So, Tara, do you want to give sort of the basic backstory of Illinois Imagines, and then I'm going to give like greatest hits of resources.
Ooh, I love it. Yes. Yeah, so Illinois Imagines is a project that started many years ago. It was funded by the Illinois Council Against Sexual Violence, ICASA, or sexual assault, sorry. And they provided a lot of training to community providers, and similar to Envision Illinois, it was a collaborative project. So rape crisis centers, disability service providers, individuals with disabilities, right? And so there were local teams, and actually the Chicago team is still meeting. So the grant ended in 2018, but we are still meeting. We're sort of the rock star team, as we so humbly acknowledge, or not so humbly. And so, yeah, Maggie, tell us a little bit about some of the resources as we move through to the end.
So thank you so much, Shazen, in the chat. So some of the resources that I have found really useful have been the, well, first and foremost, you can always start with the assessment for accessibility for your agency. So if you go to, and I'll actually paste in the Illinois Imagines website, and that's got all of these documents or resources we're going to talk about. So first off, start with that assessment and see where your agency could use some accessibility help. That's always a great start. And then there are specific guides for therapists, for advocates, and for pretty much everything you would need to do at a rape crisis agency. If we could skip ahead actually to the social stories or like the picture guides. Yeah, these ones in particular. So as a prevention educator, I helped Resilience put together its first curriculum for teaching high school students with disabilities about sexual violence and about healthy sexuality. And I utilize these social stories and these images a lot in designing that curriculum. And these are something that I think are really handy to have nearby, if no matter what your role is, so it can help you to communicate with that survivor. And if we can keep going there, even some pictures of what does the evidence collection process look like. These can be super, super handy for advocates to keep in their bag as well. So that, again, it's just a different tool to communicate with survivors that I think is so amazing and I'm so grateful for.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I want to just remind everyone that we have another webinar in December scheduled to go through, to just do a more deep dive to design a foundation for action planning to mobilize support. So I hope that today's presentation has helped you all to think about some of the ways that maybe your organization could be doing things a little better. And as Maggie said, start off with that assessment. I think that's a really great place to start. We have our team, specifically the Illinois Imagines team and Resilience and the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance. We are here to support organizations to go through that process and think about action planning. So maybe, really having staff take the assessment and then compiling the information and really starting to think through what are 1 to 3 things that you can start to make changes. We've seen agencies, update their policies or update their website to include a notion that disabled people are welcome, right? Whether it's just pictures of disabled people or the language or increasing font or making something more readable. We have Christine back on our team who is an expert on universal design. And so we do have resources to support in your organization. And again, just being disability responsive, I think that's definitely something that we have talked about. Responding to those assessments that you find, and again, educating your staff. I know some of you are here today representing your organization. Maybe you want to have us do another presentation for your staff. We're certainly available for that. And then, really start to remove those barriers. And another thing too is collaborate with other agencies. I think this is something that Maggie and I talked about beforehand, that we have loved working together because, when you work in your organization, you get used to, what you know, your team knows what they know. And when you get to collaborate outside of your own little silo, you just learn so much. I asked Maggie, I spent 10 minutes earlier asking her about the education she's doing with kindergartners in schools and how that all works. It's so fascinating. And just collaborating too and seeing how she makes a PowerPoint and learning little tips and tricks. I think those are ways that we can all benefit from working together and knowing what's in your community. If you're a rape crisis center serving a particular community in the state, wherever you are, what are the agencies and supports around you? What are those disability service providers? How can you get connected with them? We know that as a result of House Bill 3299, agencies now have to provide this education. And I'm telling you that they are scared, right? Because a lot of them have not done this before. Their staff are certainly not trained. They're not necessarily equipped to handle disclosures, right? And so these are all ways that you can support agencies to work through that process and also learn from them as well, and have survivors with disabilities take the lead, right? Yeah, and so adapting any policies that you can work through, and then developing written agreements, doing cross trainings and response protocols. Okay. Here is again, this is a resource page. These are incredible resources that we encourage you all to familiarize yourself with. I want to give a shout out to some folks from the Alliance team, Christine Beck, for compiling a really thorough list of resources on the Department of Human Services website, and looking through some of the curriculums that have been approved by committee through the state of Illinois, and then also for just really familiarizing yourself with disability services and how they work. And then also we have another comment on information and technology assistance through the Great Lakes Americans with Disabilities Act Center, which has been put into the chat. So I would really love for folks, if you're able to stick around for one more minute, I want to end with Adam, our self-advocate, telling you something that we have heard from individuals with disabilities. So please, Adam, take it away.
We've been hurt. We need your support. We're not all the same. Everyone communicates. Listen carefully. Some of us need accommodations. We are experts on how our bodies work. We are incredible witnesses. Sorry, this
It's okay.
I can't put this.
Oh, it's okay.
slide.
It says encourage others to include us. And then lastly, it says, thank you for supporting us. So wanting to remind everyone just about self-care, I think we all kind of understand the ins and outs of that. And then if you have any questions and want to stick around, please do. Just to let you know that this is this is our second of 9 webinars in this series. So we will be talking about specifically considerations for providers tomorrow, then people with disabilities on Thursday. December 15th is that webinar I referenced earlier, where we encourage you all to come back. Maybe it's with your executive director or different members of your team to think through how we can start action planning and putting some of this into practice. We're here to help support that. And then lastly, these are additional events that are really exciting. And I really hope that everyone can share these with people in their networks, whether it's people with or without disabilities. We're holding a Healthy Relationships talk on December 3rd. We have a phenomenal list of participants. It's so exciting. Then we have an art and trauma recovery event featuring artists with disabilities who will be sharing all of their amazing artwork. Next, we're going to have a presentation about disability and bisexuality, and really focusing on healthcare outcomes and research that's coming from a professor at University of Illinois at Chicago, Kate Caldwell. And then lastly, we have our Healthy Sexuality and Sexual Expression panel. So that's going to be a really fun event where we talk about sex toys and accommodations and kink, and just really get into it and have some fun. So thank you all so much for your participation. If you have any questions, please email us. We are here to help. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. And yes, special thanks to Tara for being an amazing lead.
Oh, I'm trying to bow. It probably looks really awkward. Thank you.
And special thanks to Adam for jumping in and helping us out.
You're welcome, Maggie.
Yeah, and thank you to Maggie for all of her wonderful, oh my gosh, we couldn't have done it without you, wonderful information.
All right, y'all. I'm going to close this out.
All right. Thank you so much.
Good job.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.